Here's a challenge. Name me a game from the late 90s where you pilot futuristic low-altitude craft capable of 400 miles per hour, featuring design from the Designers Republic and an electronic soundtrack from Warp Records. There's a clue in that last statement. There's a bigger clue in that the game I'm thinking of is an Elite-style open-ended game where you could be a trader, a bounty hunter, a pirate, or whichever blend of all three is necessary to advance the plot. Yes, for all three of you that got the answer, I am talking about 1998's Hardwar. This is not one of those games where many people preserved the big cardboard box. Okay, before electronic music enthusiasts berate me with a chorus of well-actuallys generated from a circuit-bent TB303, let's get talking about the game. And if you're wondering how such a forgotten title had such high-profile contributors, it's worth mentioning the publisher Gremlin was, like Warp and DR, based in Sheffield, with the developer's Software Refinery not far away in Leeds. The Software Refinery's first major PC game was Slipstream 5000, a game in which you race futuristic low-altitude craft at high speed. Before we raise the subject of a certain PlayStation classic, and being derivative thereof, it's worth mentioning that this released a good few months before the first Wipeout, and it shows it. While the 3D is fast and impressive for the time, we're clearly an old-fashioned DOS software rendering, with its bright and cartoon-like textures, and the music is of the cheerful MIDI variety, rather than pounding techno. Oh dear. That's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? Harsh, mechanical, and unforgiving techno. There we go. The Hardwar concept began as a DOS follow-up to Slipstream 5000, in a way that was very typical of DOS games from the second half of the 90s. A bit moodier, a bit of a darker palette, a bit more complex and free-ranging when it came to gameplay. You can see some of this heritage in that while the end game is a Windows affair, with 3D acceleration, the objects are somewhat low in polygon count, even by that era's standards. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Talking about the tech, before I talk about the game. Just where is Smithy's calf, Smithy's calf, Smithy's calf, calf, calf? Sorry, in-joke. Just what is Hardwar? I'm presuming you want me to say more than find out, and end the video never to be heard from again. So Hardwar is, broadly speaking, an interesting variation on an Elite clone, with a plot. The Elite series itself had dabbled with plot, Elite Plus having a series of hard-coded missions, and 1995's Frontier First Encounters having a lot of a full story mapped out for the first 2 to 3 years of in-game time, although in both cases they're optional, and you could easily miss both stories entirely if you didn't look in the right places. Hardwar sits somewhere between these games and the slightly more overt story of Egosoft's 1999 take on the Elite genre, X Beyond the Frontier. From early on in the game, you'll start seeing messages in amongst your regular trading announcements and reward bounties, giving you some additional world building, then sending you out to investigate things and instigate trouble. Until then, it plays very much like you'd expect from a version of Elite, where you're constrained to the surface. You fly around in a Moth, a solar-powered craft which needs to fly in daylight or sit in a light well to recharge. This gives an extra dimension to the gameplay, because while trundling around doing little more than scouting and a bit of light trading won't deplete your energy reserves, using your lasers and recharging your shields will. Fighting is a nervous in and out affair, where a long battle will leave you drained of power and vulnerable to anyone who happens to come along and take a shine to your cargo. Being a late 90s game, where ideas like fairness started creeping in, the AI are also subject to the same rules. When you're out bounty hunting, one of the easiest ways to take down a pirate is wait for them to do a bit of piracy, then take them down once they're low on energy and desperately searching for the nearest light well. Much of Hardwar's gameplay takes on this nervous, scurrying nature. even with a fancy moth and a bunch of upgraded systems, you never feel powerful. Whereas Frontier would allow you to endlessly shuttle between Barnard Star and Sol, without the slightest risk of anything interesting happening. Trade in Hardwar takes place with the ever-present threat that someone out there wants to take your stuff away from you. The moment you have more than a few units of all but the cheapest cargo, you'll constantly be getting red warnings that a pirate is suddenly interested in having a forceful conversation about who should possess those computer parts. It's a surprisingly accurate prediction about trying to purchase a new GPU from a time where gaming GPUs themselves had only existed for a couple of years. The downside of this is you have a game where combat is both hard and inevitable. Trade profits are also firmly at the grinding end of the scale, meaning even if you find a relatively safe trade route, you'll still be forced to supplement your income with bounty hunting and scavenging if you want to replace your basic starting equipment. And while the plot missions pay well, they will also bring you into conflict with powerful factions. Luckily, it doesn't take too much of this before you can buy your own hangar, at which point money will start rolling in while you're out trading and scavenging. This is all normal for a late 90s PC game though. It was a slower time, when grinding through barely profitable trade and repeatedly seeing game over followed by a sudden exit to desktop was considered longevity, rather than a waste of time, or an opportunity for some monetization. Even by modern standards, this is a good game. It strikes a nice balance between trading, fighting, and exploration. The plot is engaging, and of course the visual style is excellent, even if it is a little primitive in today's eyes. So why isn't Hardwar more well known? And why, despite this obscurity, am I happily playing it on a modern PC with support for full HD widescreen and an Xbox controller? Here is a good time to talk about Wipeout. Specifically, Wipeout's marketing. Wipeout's design and soundtrack tied together closely with how it was marketed. Slick print ads appeared not just in gaming publications, but in lads magazines. PlayStations running Wipeout were installed in nightclubs. This was not a toy for your kid brother. This was the game you put on when the lads came round for a few beers. Spending hours trading ores and purified water does not fit that image. Gremlin were not good at marketing at the best of times. Compare, it's in the game, with Actua Soccer's... what was Actua Soccer marketed with? Other than, hey, we bundled a copy free with your graphics card. You'll forget it and play incoming instead. In the case of Hardwar, they were also fed up with a game that had taken 18 months to develop, and was a weird space thing anyway. Developers at the software refinery complained that the only people who seemed to care about Hardwar and want to champion it were the QA team who were playing it every day. The protracted development time was not their fault either. Let me illustrate this by showing you this early DOS prototype, where some of the configuration files still refer to it internally as Slipstream 2. 1996 was an unfortunate time to start a 3D game. At the start of the year, software rendering in 640x480, with a 320x200 option for laggard 486 owners, was entirely normal and acceptable. Then came PowerVR, then the 3DFX Voodoo graphics, then the Pentium MMX, and, amongst all of this, the idea that with all this hardware, and its requisite drivers, then perhaps we should be running our games on Windows 95. So Hardwar had to be upgraded and reshaped for these new technologies. Largely, the team did a good job. You can see the lineage from this early DOS version, but while some assets are a little light on polygon count, there are all the transparency effects and coloured lights consumers expected from a game in 1998, with good draw distances and frame rates, even on original hardware. none of which matters if the game isn't marketed well. One of my friends had this at the time, and I thought it was really cool. But once I had a 3D accelerator capable of running it, there was always another game to capture my attention. Carmageddon 2, Half-Life, The Need for Speed 3. And no Hardwar ads in magazines, or displays in shops to remind me, hey, what about that cool space game you liked? Despite this, it did not become a dead game. Because there's a lot of depth, and it plays well, Hardwar spawned the inevitable fan sites, despite low sales. Developer Ian Martin said of the game, without fan sites, without evidence of fan interest, there would have been no updates. But they found the fan sites, and so support and update it they did. The game was largely reliable and bug-free from launch, although early patches had to deal with some flaky 3DFX support. But after this, the path was clear to start adding features, like new moths, and the ability to ride the monorails, rather than just crash into them while trying to navigate those claustrophobia-inducing tunnels. Hardwar's official support ran out in the early 2000s, along with the closure of the software refinery, and the acquisition of Gremlin by... well, it's the early 2000s, who else but Infogrames? As with most acquisitions by Infogrames, and the exciting legal rollercoaster assets of that company went on, this means the Hardwar rights and source code have been in legal limbo for a long time. While there was a concerted fan effort to recover them in 2016, the high potential legal costs left the project in limbo, and sadly interest from the people who could help has waned since. In addition to missing source code, this meant the final patch for Hardwar never arrived in its final state. This would have been version U3, but all that exists for that are a few betas that were made public after one of the people with access to them was found trying to sell them for money. And then something interesting happened. Original developer Ian Martin started building his own patches, the UIM series. While he also had no access to the locked away source code, he was able to add bump mapping, support for USB joysticks with multiple analog axes, and alter the sky colour to something more scientifically plausible. Unfortunately, Ian Martin disappeared from Hardwar forums in 2006, but fans have continued to extend the UIM patch series with further new features and bug fixes. All of which makes it a shame that while there is a kind of director's cut of this game, which runs well on modern hardware, the legal status means it hasn't been put up on any electronic storefronts. Thankfully, as part of the unloved detritus of the era, it's nowhere near the silly values being asked of more popular retro games, and can be had quite cheaply on auction sites, although copies are rare, and, as I have, tend to be only the CDs rather than the full game package. Personally, I think it's aged quite well. Yes, the difficulty and early game grind are from another age, but it's an intriguing take on the Elite formula, with a style all of its own. And since I'm unlikely to be out clubbing anytime soon and looking for entertainment for the after party, I'd rather have this than PS1 Wipeout.